In the early 1980s, the Detroit Pistons were a complete disaster. In 1980, they lost 66 games, the worst record in franchise history. The next season wasn't much better, with 60 more losses. To make matters worse, fans weren't showing up. The team played in the massive Pontiac Silverdome, which could hold over 80,000 people, but only 5,000 were showing up. It looked more like a graveyard than an NBA arena. Worse still, no players wanted to join Detroit. The city was struggling with crime, the team was irrelevant, and the future looked hopeless. But that started to change in 1981. The Pistons had the number 2 pick in the NBA draft, and they had their eyes on a kid who had just won a national championship at Indiana, Isiah Thomas. The problem? Isiah didn't want to play in Detroit. He was trying to land with his hometown team, the Chicago Bulls, and did everything possible to sabotage his interview with the Pistons. But Detroit's general manager, Jack McCloskey, nicknamed Trader Jack, wasn't buying it. He saw right through Isiah's act and told him straight up, "If you're there at number 2, we're taking you." And he did. That one decision changed everything. Isiah Thomas quickly proved he was a franchise player. In his rookie season, the Pistons won 18 more games than the year before. McCloskey kept building. At a game in Cleveland, he noticed a scrappy, aggressive center who kept fighting even when his team was getting blown out. That player was Bill Laimbeer, and McCloskey traded for him immediately. With Thomas and Laimbeer as the new core, Detroit finally had an identity: tough, gritty, and relentless. By 1983, both players were all-stars. But the team still couldn't get over the hump, missing the playoffs for the 6th straight year. So McCloskey made another bold move. He fired the head coach and hired Chuck Daly, a no-nonsense leader who would become one of the most respected coaches in NBA history. That was the turning point. In Daly's first season, Detroit had the number 1 offense in the NBA and saw a massive jump in attendance. Fans were finally coming back. The Pistons made the playoffs for the first time in years, but got bounced early by Bernard King, who averaged 42 points in the series. Still, the wheels were finally turning. Detroit was no longer irrelevant. They were hungry, aggressive, and just getting started. After years of rebuilding, the Pistons were finally in the playoffs, but they weren't satisfied with just making it. They wanted more. And Jack McCloskey, their mastermind GM, wasn't done adding pieces. In 1985, the Pistons drafted a quiet but deadly shooting guard named Joe Dumars with the 18th overall pick. He wasn't flashy, but he was smart, disciplined, and a perfect complement to Isiah Thomas in the backcourt. Dumars would become the calm within Detroit's storm, the technician surrounded by chaos. The very next day, McCloskey made another big move, trading for Rick Mahorn, one of the most physical screen setters and toughest enforcers in the league. Mahorn wasn't afraid to knock someone to the floor, and he fit right in with the gritty identity Detroit was building. With Thomas, Laimbeer, Dumars, and now Mahorn, the Pistons had a growing core of fighters. But the 1986 season was another disappointment. They lost in the first round to Atlanta, and many teams would have panicked, fired the coach, blown up the roster, started over. Not Detroit. Instead, McCloskey doubled down. He added 2 more critical pieces in the 1986 NBA draft: John Salley, a long, athletic forward who could defend and block shots, and Dennis Rodman, a 25-year-old with a troubled past and endless energy. Just a few years earlier, Rodman was working as a janitor at an airport. Now he was in the NBA, raw, fearless, and relentless. His motor never stopped, and neither did his hustle. And if that wasn't enough, the Pistons added Adrian Dantley, a 2-time NBA scoring champion. It was the final piece. Suddenly, Detroit wasn't just a tough team, they were a contender. By 1987, the Pistons stormed through the first 2 rounds of the playoffs and found themselves in a heavyweight clash with their biggest rival, the Boston Celtics. The Celtics were the kings of the Eastern Conference. Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, Robert Parrish, all legends. But the Pistons were younger, faster, and hungry to knock the champs off their throne. The series was brutal. After 4 games, it was tied 2-2. In Game 5, the Pistons held a 1-point lead with just seconds remaining. All they had to do was inbound the ball and the game was theirs. Then, disaster struck. Isiah Thomas made the worst turnover of his career. A soft pass intended for Laimbeer was intercepted by Larry Bird, who dished it to Dennis Johnson for the game-winning layup. It was a gut punch. One of the most iconic steals in NBA history, and one of the biggest blunders in Pistons history. Detroit managed to win Game 6, but lost the deciding Game 7, and just like that, their dream season was over. But they weren't discouraged. If anything, they came back hungrier. In the 1988 season, Chuck Daly's vision of a 94-foot defense, full-court pressure all game long, came to life. Most NBA teams played passive defense, dropping back and letting opponents set up. Not the Pistons. They fought from tip-off to buzzer. They bumped you, shoved you, harassed you. They turned every possession into a war. The results were undeniable. Detroit won 54 games, drew 25,000 fans per night, best in the league, and finished with the second-best defense in the NBA. Dennis Rodman got more minutes, and the team's identity hardened: relentless defense, unshakable toughness, and controlled chaos. In the playoffs, they rolled past Washington and then did something huge. They beat Michael Jordan and the Bulls in the second round, handing MJ his first real playoff beating. After that came another rematch with the Celtics, but this time, Detroit was ready. Laimbeer even stirred the pot by being the first player on the court in Boston Garden, walking to center court and spitting on the Leprechaun logo, just to taunt the crowd. The Celtics were older, worn down, and this time they had no answer. The Pistons beat them in 6 games and reached the NBA Finals for the first time in franchise history. Waiting for them, the Los Angeles Lakers, Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, James Worthy. Another dynasty. Another mountain to climb. But the Pistons weren't intimidated. In fact, they led the series 3-2, and in Game 6, Isiah Thomas had one of the most legendary performances in NBA history. He sprained his ankle badly, but stayed in the game, hobbling on one leg, and scored 25 points in the third quarter alone. He finished with 43 points, and with 30 seconds left, Detroit was leading by 1. And then, heartbreak. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar took a skyhook, got a phantom foul call against Laimbeer, and the Lakers won by 1 point. Game 7 was another close battle, but this time, Rodman blew a fast break that could have turned the game, and the Pistons came up short. Their finals dream ended just inches away from glory. But they weren't going anywhere. In fact, they were about to take over the league. After their heartbreaking loss in the 1988 finals, the Pistons didn't sulk, they transformed. They embraced their identity. No more trying to be liked. No more hoping for respect. When the NBA labeled them the Bad Boys in their official team highlight video, they didn't argue, they wore it like armor. Isiah Thomas smirked at the name. The rest of the team ran with it. Soon, the Pistons were selling Bad Boys t-shirts, posters, and jackets. Their style of play got even rougher, meaner, and more unapologetic. If you hated them, good, that meant it was working. The 1989 season became their revenge tour. They set a franchise record with 63 wins, finished with the best record in the league, and absolutely steamrolled through the playoffs. First, they swept the Celtics, finally burying their longtime rival. Then they swept the Milwaukee Bucks, barely breaking a sweat. And then came the real test, Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. Jordan was already the most electric player in the league, the future face of the NBA. But the Pistons had a plan, the Jordan rules. Crafted by head coach Chuck Daly and executed to perfection, the Jordan rules were a defensive blueprint specifically designed to shut down Michael Jordan. It wasn't just strategy, it was psychological warfare. If MJ was at the top of the key, they'd force him left and double-team him. If he was on the wing, help defenders would trap him immediately. If he got into the paint, hit him. Every time. Even if it meant drawing a foul. As Daly explained, we weren't trying to be dirty, we just had to be physical. But as Dennis Rodman put it more bluntly, if you can't beat him, beat him. And it worked. Jordan fought, but he couldn't fight everyone at once. The Pistons were relentless. They wore him down. Game after game, he was bruised, frustrated, and alone. Chicago had no answer for Detroit's wall of bodies and fists. The Pistons won the series in 6 games and were headed back to the NBA Finals. This time, it was a rematch with the Lakers, but everything had changed. The Lakers were limping into the series. Byron Scott injured his hamstring before Game 1. Then, Magic Johnson pulled his hamstring in Game 2, leaving Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, now 41 years old, to carry the team. It wasn't close. The Pistons swept the Lakers 4-0 and finally became NBA champions for the first time in franchise history. After a decade of rebuilding, grinding, and getting pushed around, the villains were now kings. And they didn't just win, they dominated. Isiah Thomas was named Finals MVP, averaging over 20 points and orchestrating the offense with surgical precision. Joe Dumars was flawless. Rodman and Laimbeer bullied the paint. Their defense swallowed teams whole. And the league took notice. These weren't underdogs anymore. These were the enforcers of the NBA. They didn't smile. They didn't apologize. They hit you in the mouth and walked away with the trophy. And the best part? They weren't done. Fresh off their 1989 championship, the Pistons were finally on top of the NBA world. But for the Bad Boys, winning once wasn't enough. They wanted a dynasty. A repeat. A legacy. And in 1990, they came back even more dangerous. They lost enforcer Rick Mahorn to the expansion draft, but that only meant more minutes for Dennis Rodman, who was becoming a defensive nightmare for opponents. That year, Rodman would win Defensive Player of the Year, the first of many in his legendary career. The team was largely unchanged, the same bruising lineup, the same philosophy, physical defense, mental warfare, and complete domination. Chuck Daly kept them disciplined. Isiah kept them focused. And the rest of the roster? They kept punching, figuratively and sometimes literally. Detroit finished the season with 59 wins, topping the Eastern Conference once again. In the playoffs, they beat the Indiana Pacers, then sent Larry Bird's Celtics packing again. And that set up the third consecutive playoff showdown with Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. But this time, the stakes were higher than ever. Jordan was older, stronger, and more determined. The Bulls were improving fast, and many thought this was finally the year they'd take the throne. But the Pistons weren't ready to hand over the crown just yet. They pulled out the Jordan rules one more time, beat him up for 6 brutal games, and ended Chicago's season again. Detroit was back in the NBA Finals, facing the Portland Trail Blazers, led by Clyde Drexler, Terry Porter, and a deep, athletic roster that could run and shoot. And the series was no cakewalk. Almost every game was close. The Blazers came to fight. But the Pistons, they knew how to win under pressure. They had been through the wars, and now they knew how to finish. With Isiah, Dumars, Rodman, Laimbeer, and Vinny, the Microwave Johnson, the Pistons closed out the Blazers in 5 games and became back-to-back NBA champions. They had done it. 2 titles in 2 years. No fluke. No luck. Just hard-nosed, violent, unrelenting basketball. But nothing lasts forever. The 1991 season was supposed to be their three-peat year. Same core, same mentality. But time was catching up to the bad boys. They won 50 games, still strong, but not dominant. In the playoffs, they scraped by the Hawks, then survived the Celtics. And then, it happened. They met the Bulls again in the Eastern Conference Finals. But this time, it was different. Jordan had evolved. The Bulls were deeper, smarter, and more prepared. They had figured Detroit out. No more falling into the traps. No more letting the Jordan rules work. This time, they swept the Pistons in 4 games, a clean, brutal revenge. And then came one of the most infamous moments in NBA history. With time running out in Game 4, the Pistons didn't wait for the buzzer. They walked off the court early, past the Bulls' bench, heads high, refusing to shake hands. Isiah, Laimbeer, Rodman, all of them, walked off in silence. To their fans in Detroit, it was gangster. Tough. The perfect final act of defiance. To the rest of the league, it was disgraceful. Bad sportsmanship, they said. Sore losers. But really, it was symbolic. It was the end of an era. The Pistons were no longer the villains holding the NBA hostage. The league had moved on. In 1992, they lost in the first round. In 1993, they missed the playoffs entirely. Rodman left. Daly resigned. And in 1994, Isiah Thomas ruptured his Achilles tendon and retired, followed by Laimbeer. Just like that, the bad boys were gone. But their impact, unforgettable. They changed how defense was played. They gave birth to some of the NBA's fiercest rivalries. And they proved you could win not with flair, but with force. The Pistons had enough talent to win the right way. But they chose another path. The path of the villain. And that's what made them legendary. Because every hero needs a villain. And no team in NBA history ever played the villain role better than the Bad Boy Pistons.